Hey everyone, Israel is currently in a war against the terror organization Hamas, and we know how hard it can be to keep up with all the news. So if you haven't had the time to stay on top of the latest developments out of Israel, we're here for you. I'm Ladarga Velazi, and this is ILTV's Weekly Review. After 5 months, the United Nations has finally acknowledged the systematic mass rape and sexual torture of Israeli women by Hamas on October 7th in a new report. It also raised serious concerns that the sexual violence is ongoing against the hostages still being held by Hamas. Let's take a look at the report. A United Nations report has found clear and convincing evidence of rape and sexual torture being committed by Hamas against Israelis during the October 7th massacre. Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict Pramila Patten announced the findings on Monday. She and her team led a 17-day visit to Israel last month to gather, analyze, and verify allegations of sexual violence. The team also found there was cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment against hostages and raised serious concerns that such violence may be ongoing against those still being held by Hamas, and called for the immediate release of the hostages.
We also found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and gang rape, occurred during the 7th of October attacks in at least 3 locations, namely the Nova Music Festival site and its surroundings, Road 232, and Kibbutz Reim. And in most of these incidents, victims were first subjected to rape and then killed, and at least 2 incidents relate to the rape of women's corpses.
The mission team also found a pattern of victims, mostly women, found fully or partially naked, bound, and shot across multiple locations. The team said it believes the true prevalence of sexual violence during the 7th of October attacks and their aftermath may take months or years to emerge and may never fully be known. Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, addressed the 193 UN General Assembly and said they should be ashamed.
This week, the world will mark International Women's Day. Next week, the Commission on the Status of Women will convene to discuss the challenges that women face worldwide. Yet this year, the UN and UN Women's silence in the face of Hamas sexual violence turned International Women's Day into a sick joke. This is the peak of the UN's hypocrisy. Yet, as we speak, right now, Israeli women are being raped and abused by Hamas terrorists. Where is the UN's voice? Where is your voice? Over the past 5 months, there has not been even one single discussion here dedicated to the well-being of the hostages. Not one debate focused on the sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas. Not one UN panel on the rape and crimes against Israeli women. The UN should be ashamed of its silence.
Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz condemned the United Nations on Monday night and announced he was recalling Israel's ambassador to the UN for immediate consultations regarding the attempt to silence the serious UN report on the mass rapes committed by Hamas and its aides on October 7th. He further called out UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, saying that despite the authority granted to him, the UN Secretary General did not order the convening of the Security Council in view of the findings. He called on him to declare Hamas organization a terrorist organization and impose sanctions on its supporters. And Israel is continuing its campaign to expose UNRWA complicity in the Hamas terror rampage on October 7th. The army is showing proof that some 450 terror operatives are also employed by what is supposed to be a Palestinian aid body. More on this from ILTV's Devo Klein.
The IDF said its intelligence shows that some 450 terror operatives in Gaza, mostly Hamas members, are also employed by UNRWA.
Over 450 UNRWA employees are military operatives in terror groups in Gaza. Over 450. This is no mere coincidence. This is systematic. There is no claiming we did not know.
The IDF says that the so-called aid workers were full-time terrorists.
These terrorists are employed by UNRWA. They receive salaries that are paid by the international community. Donations that are meant for humanitarian purposes, meant to benefit the people of Gaza, are funding mass murderers and rapists.
The IDF on Monday released audio recordings that directly incriminate UNRWA employees who participated in the Hamas-led October 7th onslaught.
عم حسن خالد معك كيف حالك؟ سلامات وين ايش اخبار؟ وين انت؟ وين السبايا والدنيا ودين عنا خليش نايم. انت بالشارع نام في الدار شارع اسكت احنا عند السبايا هنا مسك وحده. اسكت. وين ايش اخبارك؟
The latest revelation brings the total number of agency workers that Jerusalem says actively participated in the attacks to 14. Jerusalem has long argued that UNRWA should be disbanded, and the recent allegations have led several donor countries to announce funding freezes. The head of UNRWA, Felipe Lazzarini, warned in a letter to the General Assembly's president that his agency is at a breaking point as donors freeze funding.
Excellencies, UNRWA is facing a deliberate and concerted campaign to undermine its operations and ultimately end them. More blatant is the Israeli Prime Minister openly stating that UNRWA will not be part of post-war Gaza. The implementation of this plan is already underway with the destruction of our infrastructure across Gaza Strip.
Israel insists that UNRWA is part of the problem and cannot be part of any future solution.
And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that Israel would not place restrictions on worshippers during the holy fasting month of Ramadan this year. This in the wake of the ongoing war in Gaza and as the security establishment raised concerns that Hamas would try to use the holiday to ignite more violence against Israelis. Israel has decided not to impose restrictions on the number of worshippers allowed to pray on the Temple Mount during the first week of the Muslim holiday of Ramadan. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced the decision after meeting with top Israeli security officials who were split on the issue.
המדיניות של ישראל תמיד הייתה ותמיד תהיה לשמור על חופש הפולחן לכל הדתות. כך נהגנו כמובן גם בחג הרמדאן וכך ננהג גם עכשיו. אנחנו נעשה הכל כדי לשמור על חופש הפולחן בהר הבית, תוך כדי שמירה מתאימה של צורכי הביטחון והבטיחות, ונאפשר לציבור המוסלמי לחוג את החג.
The Prime Minister's office said that a weekly assessment of the security and safety aspects will be held and adjustments on limitations will be made accordingly. Following the announcement, right-wing National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir slammed the decision, saying it would endanger Israelis. The decision to allow a similar ascension to the Temple Mount on Ramadan as in previous years shows that Netanyahu and the limited war cabinet think that nothing occurred on October 7th. He said the decision may also allow an image of victory for Hamas. Each year during Ramadan, hundreds of thousands of Muslim worshippers access the Temple Mount, the site of Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam. Israel has expressed concern that Hamas and the Axis of Resistance, backed by Iran, will use the fasting holiday this year in the wake of the war to ignite more violence in the region. In previous years, the month of Ramadan was characterized by an increase in violence and attempted terror attacks against Israelis. Just last week, the head of Hamas's political wing, Ismail Haniyeh, called on Palestinians to storm the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the first day of Ramadan and urged them to carry out terror attacks, calling the holiday month a month of jihad. And joining us now with more on the latest security situation across all of Israel's fronts is Alex Treyman, Jerusalem Bureau Chief at JNS. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lidar.
So lots to cover. Let's start with Gaza. The prospect of a hostage deal seems less and less likely ahead of Ramadan. So the question remains, why is Israel not advancing in Rafah, maybe exerting more pressure on Hamas?
Well, they're certainly operating in the southern Gaza Strip. They're operating very heavily in Khan Yunis. The international community is hoping to get and have a plan approved whereby Israel can move as many of the residents out of Rafah as possible before they go in with heavy fighting. I think that it will happen within the next coming weeks. There was the opportunity perhaps to get a hostage deal, which, as you mentioned, I think that is waning. I do expect that we'll see the attacks inside Rafah in the coming weeks.
In the coming weeks. And, I want to move now to the northern front because a lot's been going on over the past 24 hours. The defense minister and other security officials warning that war with Hezbollah is fast approaching. We've been waiting for a diplomatic solution for some time now, but that doesn't seem to be advancing either. Now Hezbollah launched really a massive missile attack against Israel in the past 24 hours. So what's your analysis on this front?
Well, we've seen really since October 7th that Hezbollah and Israel have been slowly escalating the level of violence. It's hard to see how it can not continue to escalate in the coming days and weeks, but it is clear that both Israel and Lebanon both are trying to, while escalating on the one hand, trying to avoid that full-scale war. In the meantime, on the other hand, but both sides are really playing with fire over here, and we've said it for weeks and even for months, but it does seem as though there's no way to avoid a full-scale operation between these two.
And is Israel prepared for a multi-front war? And if so, also, there's the question of how the international community will respond to such an event.
Well, Israel's been giving as much lip service as possible to the idea of a diplomatic solution, and that actually aids its efforts to gain the traction in the international community. If a diplomatic solution is not made, then Israel can say, look, we've been trying for weeks and months to reach a diplomatic solution, but you see that they continue to escalate their attacks, and they've left us no choice but to go in. At the same time, you mentioned an important component, which is that Israel does not want to fight a multi-front war. They believe that it is better to finish up the operations in Gaza because you have limited amounts of air power, you have limited numbers of tanks, you have limited number of soldiers, and if you're going to be fighting in the north, so which soldiers are you taking? Which tanks are you taking? They want to get everything out of the south first, and that's the reason why they're willing to pay lip service to the diplomatic solution because it gives them time to finish the operations in Gaza.
And now I want to look towards Ramadan. Israel has decided, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has decided not to impose restrictions on worshippers at the Temple Mount. The decision tried to balance between sort of security considerations on the one hand and outrage should Israel impose security restrictions. So what does this essentially mean on the ground, and how much of a security risk does this now pose to Israel?
Well, it's a very big security risk. The Arabs and Hamas have said, even from the beginning of this war, but for years back, they launched the war saying that this was the Al-Aqsa flood. That was the name of their operation. So they're talking about liberating the Temple Mount, and they could potentially be looking to utilize the Temple Mount, get as many Arabs and Hamas supporters as possible to the Temple Mount on Ramadan, which has unfortunately been a holy month for killing Jews historically here in the last several years in the state of Israel, and to use it as a launching point for a second October 7th attack. And Israel's been under a lot of pressure to demonstrate that it protects freedom of worship, but this is freedom of worship during a war. We saw in 2021 during the last flare-up that Hamas hung banners, billboards all over the Temple Mount, and they use it as the fulcrum for incitement against the Jewish people. It's a very, very fragile situation, and it could very well be that even though in the beginning they'll allow the full amount of worshipers, that it might be a short amount of time over this month-long holiday whereby they reduce significantly the number of worshipers that are allowed up on the Mount.
Absolutely. We already saw a terrorist attack today in Jerusalem, and we know that unfortunately Ramadan brings a lot of violence with it as well. Here in Israel. Alex Treyman, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has weighed in on the supercharged issue of the conscription of ultra-Orthodox men into the IDF. The issue must be resolved by the end of this month, and there could be practical ramifications, as we hear from ILTV's William Sharon.
Prime Minister Netanyahu said his government would establish a path to conscript ultra-Orthodox Israelis. The comment followed the challenge gambit placed by Defense Minister Gallant, threatening to block a law that would allow the continuation of exemptions unless the government reached an agreement, paving a path for ultra-Orthodox enlistment.
אנחנו נקבע יעדים לגיוס חרדים לצה"ל ולשירות האזרחי. ואנחנו נקבע גם את הדרכים להבטיח את מימוש היעדים הללו. אפשר להשיג הסדר זה בלי לפלג את העם ובלי להסית נגד אף ציבור. אני בטוח שניתן להשיג הסדר זה, להסדר זה רוב בכנסת, אבל גם ברור לי דבר אחד, אי אפשר להשיג הסכמה מוחלטת.
The Netanyahu and Gallant comments come amid demands for sharing the burden and becoming more empathetic after the October 7th rampage, which has stoked divides between religious and secular Israeli society and threatened to end the coalition's narrow Knesset majority. Israel's Supreme Court in 2018 voided a law waiving the draft for ultra-Orthodox men, citing a need for the burden of military service to be shared across Israeli society. The Knesset has so far failed to come up with a new agreement, and a government-issued stay on mandatory conception of ultra-Orthodox that expires next month. Ultra-Orthodox parties have helped Netanyahu hold a parliamentary majority alongside far-right nationality parties in past governments, and have made a draft exemption a key condition for remaining in the coalition.
And now let's take a look at the resilient residents of the southern city of Sderot, a city scarred by the brutal events of the October 7th attack. This community, torn apart by the heinous acts of Hamas terrorists, is now facing the challenging task of rebuilding and regaining a sense of normalcy.
In the aftermath of the October 7th massacre, about 90% of Sderot's population, approximately 27,000 residents, fled their homes. The city became a battleground that day as over 100 terrorists roamed freely, unleashing chaos on the streets and in people's homes. Now, Sderot is on the path to recovery as thousands have returned home after months of displacement, and schools finally reopened for the city's children this week for the first time since the October 7th attack.
תלמידים שלנו לא היו כאן כ5 חודשים, ומבחינתנו היום זה יום חגיגי של פתיחת שנת לימודים פעם נוספת. ואנחנו מאחלים לתלמידים שנת לימודים מוצלחת.
The repopulation plan offering financial incentives to returning families has played a significant role in this return. And for these parents, returning home evokes a mix of emotions.
זה מאוד מפחיד, אנחנו מאוד חוששים. אבל אנחנו חזקים, זה המדינה שלנו, אין לנו לאן לברוח, אנחנו נביא את הילדים שלנו. ובעזרת השם יהיה בסדר.
The scars of October 7th will surely remain etched in the city's landscape. And as these resilient residents return to their homes, they hope to slowly rebuild what has been broken.
And joining us now in studio is Pastor Trey Graham. Thank you for coming in.
Great to see you.
Israel is facing difficult times these past few months, certainly here on the ground, but also around the world, as it seems so many are turning against Israel. And surely in these challenging times, evangelical support is very important. Can you please tell me about this kind of support coming from your community?
Well, anti-Semitism is a problem around the world, and it's seen a lot more clearly in the last few months, but it's not a new problem. It's a long-term problem. And we who are followers of Jesus, we who believe the Bible, understand that God made a covenant with one people about one land, and that's the people of Israel about the land of Israel. And so anti-Semitism is not just hatred of the Jews, which it is, but it's hatred of God's plan. It's hatred of God's covenant. Now, there's prejudice of all kinds, prejudice against different groups, but anti-Semitism is different because we believe it's spiritual warfare. And so those who pray, those who believe the Bible, those who believe in God's covenant will stand against anti-Semitism.
Now, we've seen many polls coming out of the United States over the last few months. I think one of the common things in all of these polls is how the younger generation seems to be a lot less supportive of Israel than the older one. Is this the case in the evangelical community as well?
There's a lot of polls, and depends on which poll you look at. I know it's a concern. I don't know if it's a certainty, but it's a concern. But that's a concern based upon the younger generation, are they as close in their faith? Are they as religious as they were before? And as I was saying a moment ago, if we believe that support for Israel is not just political and diplomatic, but it's spiritual, then it's really based upon a person's spiritual growth. And the question is always about the next generation. Where will they be in their faith?
Are there any kind of initiatives or any type of messages that you try to convey to your younger generation in order to garner this kind of support for Israel?
Sure, there's a lot of efforts that I work with different organizations in Israel that are trying to do that, whether that's Bible studies, whether that's small books for kids like coloring books and puzzles. There's lectures, there's teaching, all kinds of things. We, again, believe it's a spiritual issue, so the better you know your Bible, the better you're going to understand Israel, and so our focus is on the Bible teaching and spiritual development side.
And generally for young Americans, how can these young Americans be drawn back to understanding the case for Israel, do you think?
Well, it covers all areas. I've said it a lot. It's a spiritual thing. It's a biblical thing. It's also political and diplomatic and legal. And it's understanding the news. It's understanding how to read the news or listen to the news and see when falsehoods are being told, when Israel's being treated differently in the UN or in the media because of an anti-Semitic bias. The charges against Israel are different. They're worse than other nations, even if their actions are not worse. So teaching people to read the news and understand the news and find the bias is a big part of helping them support Israel, because they can realize that the news that they're reading that's negative often isn't true.
So to be informed, to be knowledgeable, and to avoid ignorance, you say?
Sure, and to learn to speak the languages, learn the terminology.
Mm-hmm. Now, the anti-Semitism that we've seen around the world, specifically also in the United States, this includes so many incidents on university campuses. So we're speaking university students. What, in your opinion, can be done to reduce these incidents on campuses?
Well, the schools themselves, the universities themselves need to ensure the safety of their students. And when pro-Israel speakers are invited, they should get the same respect, the same courtesy, the same security that an anti-Israel speaker should. And the students who are there to learn should be exposed to both sides of this issue.
Now, the annual Israel Allies Foundation, with more than 20 Christian lawmakers, is here in Israel this week on a visit. They are constantly trying to garner pro-Israel support and legislation through faith-based diplomacy with Israel. How effective is their voice, do you think?
It's very effective. And I know this organization, I've worked with them and their leader, Josh Reinstein. It's a very important organization because we've talked so far about religious groups or churches. We've talked about the media and the universities. This is on the political level, getting parliaments and governments around the world to understand these same issues, that Israel deserves the same respect that other countries do. And if they are Christian lawmakers, they're combining their faith background and their political background to stand for truth, but using their platform as elected officials.
Now, I'll just ask you one last question. There have been calls around the world to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. Where does your community stand on this?
Well, we understand that there's been sort of a test run of that theory, and that's called the Gaza Strip, when Israel unilaterally withdrew. And look what it's turned into. So there's no way on the ground right now that the conditions exist for a Palestinian state that could be run in a safe and cooperative manner with Israel. That's only the diplomatic answer. The spiritual answer is we don't ever believe that God has a design to divide his land.
Pastor Trey Graham, thank you very much.
Great to see you.
For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at iltv.tv or download the ILTV Plus app. That's it for ILTV's weekly review. Stay safe and see you next week.